Warning: this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. They called themselves the Keepers. A twisted brotherhood of sadists who thrived in the dank underground tunnels beneath the city, far away from the light and sanity of the world above. I had escaped that hellhole once, but my freedom felt temporary. Their whispers followed me like shadows, growing louder each night. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if they were truly coming for me. It started a month ago when I first encountered their temple. I was a drifter, always on the move, trying to find some semblance of purpose in the chaos of life. That's when I met Kyle. A street rat like me, but there was something in his eyes, an emptiness that intrigued me. We started talking, hanging around the same spots, until one night he invited me somewhere special. We descended into the city's underbelly, a network of forgotten tunnels and chambers. The darkness felt alive, pulsating with an energy that wrapped around my throat like an invisible noose. I followed Kyle, feeling a cocktail of dread and curiosity swirl in my gut. We reached a massive iron door adorned with carvings of blood-drenched blades. "The Temple of Agony," Kyle whispered with reverence as he pushed the door open. The stench of decay hit me like a sledgehammer. Inside, rows of hooded figures surrounded an altar, their eyes fixed on the object of worship, a grotesque statue of a godlike figure with 1,000 tiny razors embedded in its skin. Blood dripped from the statue, pooling into a basin at its feet. That's when I realized what this was, a cult. And I was about to become part of their ritual. The initiation was beyond words. It was pain incarnate. They stripped me, bound me to a rusting surgical table, and began their ritual with surgical tools and razors so sharp they sang when touched. "Pain is the path to divinity," they chanted as they carved into my flesh. Every slice was deliberate, almost tender, as my skin, slicing open pathways of raw nerves and flesh. I remember screaming, but there was no one to hear me except them, their eyes gleaming with ecstasy as they watched me writhe. I don't know how long I was on that table. Hours, days, maybe even weeks. Time bled into itself, an endless cycle of pain and darkness. But somehow, I survived. The god of pain, as they called it, found me unworthy to die just yet. That's when I saw my chance. During one of their rituals, as the cultists were lost in their blood-soaked ecstasy, I broke free from my bindings, adrenaline drowning out the pain. I stumbled through the tunnels, half dead but determined to escape. That was 3 weeks ago. I managed to crawl back to the surface, a miracle I still don't fully understand. But I wasn't safe. The cult of razors never lets anyone leave. I was a loose end, a broken chain in their sadistic order. And now they were hunting me. I've been on the run since, hopping between abandoned buildings, derelict motels, and back alleys. But they were relentless. Every night, I felt their eyes on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind was them drawing closer. The wounds on my body had barely begun to scab over, yet they burned with fresh intensity each time I felt their presence. They were marking me from a distance, reminding me that my suffering was far from over. Tonight, I holed up in an abandoned factory on the city's outskirts. Its rotting walls provided some semblance of shelter, though it couldn't keep out the chill of fear creeping into my bones. I found a rusted metal bar and clutched it tightly, my only weapon if they found me. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. Hours passed, and the silence pressed against my ears, heavy and suffocating. Then, I heard it, a faint scraping sound. Metal against metal. The unmistakable sound of shadows that stretched and twisted in the dim light. They were here. A hooded figure emerged from the darkness, his face hidden behind a mask fashioned from razor shards. "You've strayed from the path of pain, but the God is merciful," he hissed, voice dripping with sickening reverence. "Return to us, and embrace the agony that will set you free." "No," I croaked, backing away. But there was no escape. More of them materialized from the shadows, encircling me with surgical tools glinting in their hands. The room reeked of blood and antiseptic, a prelude to the nightmare about to unfold. They moved closer, their breathing heavy and synchronized like a hive of locusts closing in on their prey. I swung the metal bar wildly, catching one of them across the jaw. A sickening crunch, but no scream. The cultist simply staggered back, righting himself almost instantly. The others closed in, one of them driving a needle into my shoulder. White-hot pain exploded in my arm, paralyzing me. My grip on the bar faltered, and it clattered to the floor. "Pain is truth," another cultist whispered as he ran a razor along my thigh, a line of crimson blooming in its wake. "No. Get away from me." I screamed, thrashing uselessly as they dragged me to the ground. My legs kicked out, but their grips were iron. They pinned me down, binding my wrists and ankles with ropes that dug into my skin, cutting off circulation. I was back in their grasp, back in the embrace of the temple, my vision blurred as they lifted me, carrying me toward a makeshift altar they had erected in the center of the room. "You belong to the god now," they chanted, their voices harmonizing in a discordant symphony of madness. They laid me on the altar, cold steel pressing against my back. I struggled, twisting and writhing, but they held me firm. The razors glinted above me, the cultists raising them high in a mockery. Leader intoned, bringing a razor to my chest. I gritted my teeth, preparing for the agony. The blade bit into my skin, peeling it away with precision, layer by layer. I felt every inch of the cut, nerves screaming in protest. But I refused to give them the satisfaction of my screams. My body convulsed, tears blurring my sight, yet I remained silent. I wouldn't let them win, but the pain. It was unbearable. My mind frayed at the edges, threatening to snap under the sheer force of the torment. I felt my consciousness slipping, fading into a sea of red. Suddenly, a crash echoed through the room. The cultists paused, looking up in confusion. Through my haze of agony, I saw a figure burst into the factory, Kyle. His eyes were wild, blood splattered across his face. "Enough," he roared, wielding a machete. He swung with reckless abandon, hacking at the cultists who shrieked and scattered like roaches under a sudden light. I felt hands tugging at my restraints. "Get up. We're getting out of here," Kyle yelled, his voice piercing through the fog of pain. I stumbled to my feet, my body screaming in protest. We bolted for the exit, crashing through the decaying door and into the cold night air. Behind us, the cultists' screams echoed, a cacophony of rage and pain. They wouldn't stop. They would never stop. But for now, I was free. We ran into the darkness, the cold wind slicing across my wounds like 1,000 tiny razors. And as we fled, one thought seared itself into my mind: this was far from over. The cult of razors would come for us again. And when they did, the temple's embrace would be colder, sharper, and far more merciless than before. The wind lashed at my open wounds as Kyle dragged me through the back alleys, deeper into the city's maze of shadows. My legs were numb, each step sent jolts of paranoia shooting through my veins. "They won't stop," I gasped, my throat raw from screaming. "They'll come for us again." Kyle's grip tightened around my wrist. "Not if we make it to the safe house," he said, though there was a tremble in his voice that betrayed his fear. Blood smeared our path, marking us like a twisted breadcrumb trail leading the cult right to us. My thoughts swirled in a haze of pain and dread as we stumbled through a crumbling warehouse district, every building looming over us like gravestones in a vast, unholy cemetery. the safe house wasn't much, a derelict factory that had been abandoned years ago. The windows shattered, walls plastered with graffiti and decay. But it had sturdy locks and thick walls, a fleeting illusion of safety. We slipped inside, bolting the door behind us. For a moment, the silence was deafening. "We're not safe here," I whispered, sliding down the wall and clutching my stomach where the cultists had started to carve their truth into me. Blood oozed between my fingers, sticky and warm. "They'll find us." Kyle knelt beside me, rummaging through a backpack he'd snatched up in our escape. "They'll come, sure," he muttered, pulling out gauze and antiseptic, "but we need to regroup. You're bleeding out, man. Let me patch you up before you go dropping dead on me." He worked quickly, ripping my tattered shirt aside to reveal the horror etched into my skin. Jagged lines of sliced flesh crisscrossed my chest, a grotesque map of the suffering I had endured. I bit down on a piece of wood he handed me as he doused my wounds with the antiseptic. Fire roared through my nerves, and I let out a muffled groan, feeling tears sting the corners of my eyes. "You should have left me," I choked out, fighting against the encroaching darkness at the edges of my vision. "I didn't break you out of that hellhole just to let them take you back. We're going to survive this. They're flesh and blood, just like us. And they can bleed." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that we could fight our way out of this nightmare. But the memory of their chanting, the razors slicing into me, the endless ocean of pain, was seared into my mind. These were not just people, they were zealots, fueled by a god of agony that they worshipped through the torture of others. Kyle finished wrapping my wounds, securing the gauze tightly. "Rest here," he said, standing and moving toward the broken windows, peering out into the night. "I'll keep watch." But rest was impossible. I closed my eyes, only to see flashes of the temple, of blood-streaked hands reaching for me, of razors glinting in the candlelight. My heart pounded, a metronome of terror that refused to quiet. Minutes stretched into hours, or so it seemed, and every creak of the building made me flinch. Then, I heard it. A faint scraping sound that slithered through the air, curling around my ears like a serpent's hiss. My eyes snapped open, and I saw Kyle tense at the window. "They're here," he breathed, his voice a hollow whisper. I struggled to my feet, clutching a rusted pipe I found beside me. My body screamed in protest, each movement a fresh onslaught of pain. Kyle grabbed his machete, glancing at me with grim resolve. "We fight," he said. "No running this time." The door splintered under the force of a sledgehammer, wood and metal exploding inward. Shadows poured into the room, a wave of hooded figures armed with razors and surgical tools. The cult of razors had found us. "You belong to the god," their leader intoned, stepping forward, the razor mask on his face glistening with fresh blood. "Your air," and into the first cultist's shoulder. Blood sprayed across the room, a crimson explosion that painted the walls. The cultists moved with eerie synchronization, encircling us like predators closing in on wounded prey. I swung my pipe, catching another across the ribs. A sickening crunch followed, but there was no scream. They merely staggered, regrouping almost instantly. They were unrelenting. One lunged at me, a gleaming scalpel poised for my throat. I twisted away, the blade grazing my cheek. Hot blood trickled down, mingling with the sweat and grime. My vision swam, the world tilting as adrenaline surged through my veins. I swung again, the pipe colliding with the cultist's arm, snapping bone. "Keep fighting." Kyle yelled, fending off two more with wild, brutal swings. But they kept coming. More poured in through the doorway, their chanting growing louder, drowning out the sounds of the struggle. "Pain is truth. Pain is truth." A razor flashed before my eyes. I jerked back, but not fast enough. The blade carved across my chest, tearing through the bandages and reopening the wounds. White-hot agony exploded in my chest, driving me to my knees. I gasped, clutching at the gaping gash as blood poured out. No. Kyle screamed, slashing through another cultist, his eyes wide with horror as he saw me fall. But the leader was on him in an instant, knocking the machete from his hand and shoving him to the ground. "You cannot escape your fate," the leader hissed, looming over me. His voice was soft, almost loving, as he brought a razor to my cheek. "The god craves your pain. Embrace it." I felt the cold steel press into my flesh, slicing a thin line down my face. My vision blurred with tears of pain and rage. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my strength was fading. Darkness swirled around the edges line, like a power tool revving up. The cultists paused, turning toward the source of the sound. In the doorway stood a figure I didn't recognize, holding what looked like a handheld electric saw. "Get away from them," the stranger bellowed, surging forward, the saw screaming as it bit into flesh and bone. The cultists shrieked, stumbling back as blood sprayed across the room. I felt hands grabbing me, dragging me away from the chaos. "Hold on." Kyle's voice, strained and panicked, filled my ears. "We're getting out of here." The stranger hacked a path through the cultists, the saw roaring like an unholy beast. I was dimly aware of being hauled to my feet, of stumbling toward the shattered windows. Kyle and the stranger hoisted me up, and I tumbled out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a sledgehammer. We ran. I don't remember how far or for how long. All I knew was the searing pain, the blood seeping from my wounds, and the endless, echoing chants of the cultists pursuing us. Finally, we collapsed in a filthy alleyway, panting and gasping for breath. The stranger turned to face us, pulling off their hood to reveal a scarred, hardened face. "You two aren't safe yet," they growled. "The cult of razors doesn't stop. Not until they have what they want." I blinked up at them, my vision swimming. Who are you?" I croaked. "A survivor," they spat, glancing back toward the darkness from which we had fled. "And if you want to stay that way, you need to learn to fight like one. This isn't over. It's only just begun." As the stranger's words sunk in, a cold realization gripped me. The cult of razors had found us once. They would find us again. And when they'd over. It's only just begun. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to scream that I'd had enough, that I couldn't survive another encounter, I knew they were right. The cult of razors wasn't finished with me, not yet. The stranger, she never gave us her name, just a curt, "Call me Rip," led us through a labyrinth of alleys, each twist and turn a dagger of paranoia in my gut. The city's lights were a distant memory here, lost in the maze of filth and decay. We came to a rusted manhole cover, and with a grunt, Rip yanked it free. "In," she snapped, nodding toward the darkness below. "This is the only place they won't follow." Kyle looked at me, his eyes bloodshot and wide. "We don't have a choice," I muttered, feeling my legs wobble under the strain of every wound stitched into my flesh. I couldn't stay up here in the open. Not with them hunting us. Rip climbed down first, her silhouette swallowed by the shadows. I followed, every movement sending jolts of pain ricocheting through my body. The metal ladder was slick with grime, and the air grew damp and foul the deeper I descended. Kyle came last, sliding the manhole cover back into place above us. The darkness was suffocating. I fought to keep my breath steady, the stench of rot curling into my nostrils. We were in the sewers now, the underbelly of the city where rats and nightmares mingled freely. Rip led the way, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. "Where are we going?" I managed to croak, clutching my side. The wound on my chest burned with each step, like molten metal eating through my nerves. Somewhere they can't reach, Rip replied, her voice cold and steady. A place they fear. We stumbled through tunnels, crossing narrow, flooded paths and ducking under ancient pipes. The pain in my body was a constant drumbeat, pounding louder with every heartbeat. I glanced at Kyle, his to my skull, this isn't over. It's only just begun. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to scream that I'd had enough, that I couldn't survive another encounter, I knew they were right. The cult of razors wasn't finished with me, not yet. The stranger, she never gave us her name, just a curt, call me Rip, led us through a labyrinth of alleys, each twist and turn a dagger of paranoia in my gut. The city's lights were a distant memory here, lost in the maze of filth and decay. We came to a rusted manhole cover, and with a grunt, Rip yanked it free. In, she snapped, nodding toward the darkness below. This is the only place they won't follow. Kyle looked at me, his eyes bloodshot and wide. We don't have a choice, I muttered, feeling my legs wobble under the strain of every wound stitched into my flesh. I couldn't stay up here in the open. Not with them hunting us. Rip climbed down first, her silhouette swallowed by the shadows. I followed, every movement sending jolts of pain ricocheting through my body. The metal ladder was slick with grime, and the air grew damp and foul the deeper I descended. Kyle came last, sliding the manhole cover back into place above us. The darkness was suffocating. I fought to keep my breath steady, the stench of rot curling into my nostrils. We were in the sewers now, the underbelly of the city where rats and nightmares mingled freely. Rip led the way, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Where are we going? I managed to croak, clutching my side. The wound on my chest burned with each step, like molten metal eating through my nerves. Somewhere they can't reach, Rip replied, her voice cold and steady. A place they fear. We stumbled through tunnels, crossing narrow, flooded paths and ducking under ancient pipes. The pain in my body was a constant drumbeat, pounding louder with every heartbeat. I glanced at Kyle, his face a mask of instantly, razor flashing toward my face. I ducked, the blade grazing my ear, a hot line of pain searing through my skull. I swung again, hacking at anything that moved. They were relentless, chanting with every strike, every slice. Pain is truth. Beside me, Kyle fought like a madman, the crowbar crushing bones and splitting skin. He grunted, his eyes wild with adrenaline. Keep moving, he yelled, smashing a cultist across the temple. Rip was a whirlwind of violence, her blade cutting down any who got close. But for every cultist that fell, two more took their place. The tunnel filled with the coppery stench of blood and the echoes of agony. A hand grabbed my arm, fingers digging into my flesh. I twisted, bringing the hatchet down hard. It bit into the cultist's hand, severing fingers in a spray of blood. He howled, stumbling back, but another cultist lashed out with a scalpel, slicing deep into my thigh. I screamed, the world tilting as pain exploded in my leg. I staggered, barely able to keep my footing. They closed in, the leader at the forefront, his masked face looming before me. Your suffering has only begun, he whispered, raising a razor to my throat. No. Kyle roared, charging forward. He drove the crowbar into the leader's side, the sound of shattering ribs echoing through the tunnel. The leader gasped, doubling over. But his eyes blazed with fury. Rip seized the moment, thrusting her blade into the leader's chest. You die here, she snarled, twisting the blade. The leader's body convulsed, his hands clawing at the air. You will never escape, he gurgled, blood bubbling from his lips. His eyes dimmed, and he crumpled to the ground. For a heartbeat, the tunnel fell silent. The remaining cultists stared, their chants faltering as their leader's lifeless form slumped in the muck. Rip stepped back, panting, blood dripping from. The cultists hesitated, glancing at their fallen leader, and for a moment, it seemed as if they were unsure. But then the chanting resumed, rising to a fevered pitch. They pursued us, their footsteps echoing like the tolling of a death knell. The tunnel twisted, opening into a wider chamber, lit by a solitary, flickering bulb. Rip skidded to a stop, her eyes scanning the room. "There," she yelled, pointing to a rusted ladder leading to a hatch above. Kyle reached it first, scrambling up, throwing the hatch open. "Go," he yelled, extending a hand to me. I grabbed it, teeth gritted against the agony in my leg as he hauled me upward. Rip was the last, slashing at the cultists as they surged forward. "Move, move," she shouted, climbing the ladder and slamming the hatch shut above us. We collapsed in a heap on the ground above, gasping for breath. Rip locked the hatch, leaning against it, her chest heaving. The cultists pounded on the metal below, their chants muffled but persistent. "Pain is truth. Pain is truth, it's a temporary reprieve," Rip panted, wiping blood from her face. "They'll find another way to us." I pressed my hand against my bleeding thigh, trying to stem the flow. "Then what now?" I croaked, my voice a ragged whisper. Rip stared at me, her eyes hard and unforgiving. "Now," she said, "we take the fight to them. This ends where it began, the temple. We either burn them out, or we die trying." Her words settled over us like a shroud, heavy and unyielding. The cult of razors would never stop. They were bound to their god of suffering, and they would hunt us until we either succumbed or eradicated them. Kyle nodded, his face pale but resolute. "We end this," he murmured, gripping the crowbar tightly. I looked at them, at the blood and pain etched into our bodies. And for the first time since this nightmare began, uttered, bleeding, but not broken. The cult of razors had taken us to the brink of hell. Now, it was time to drag them down with us. The sky was a sickly gray as dawn threatened to break over the city, but there was no comfort in that thin light. It only deepened the shadows of the alleyways, made the blood crusting my skin glisten like a gruesome mask. We had only one destination left, their temple. And we were bringing fire and fury to those who called themselves the instruments of pain. Rip led us through the labyrinth of streets, her eyes burning with a hatred that matched my own. She had stuffed our bags with whatever weapons we could scrounge up, Molotov cocktails, knives, even a half-broken chainsaw that sputtered menacingly when revved. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was an execution. The temple loomed ahead, a forgotten, crumbling warehouse at the edge of the city. Its boarded-up windows were smeared with symbols, circles intersected by lines, crudely drawn eyes weeping blood. This was the place where nightmares were born, where they had strapped me to a table and carved truths into my skin with razors while chanting their twisted gospel. Kyle pushed the door open, his crowbar raised like an axe ready to split bone. The silence inside was oppressive, broken only by the faint drip of water from the ceiling. My heart pounded in my chest. Every beat a reminder of why we were here, to end this, once and for all. The main chamber stretched out before us, littered with makeshift altars and racks of surgical tools, gleaming in the dim light. My stomach churned as the memories flooded back, the screams, the feel of cold metal slicing into flesh. But I forced them down. Fear had no place here now. "They'll be waiting for us," Rip muttered, moving forward with a knife gripped tight in her hand. "Stay close," steps echoing off the blood-stained walls. Kyle lit a Molotov cocktail, the flame casting grotesque shadows across the room. "When they come," he whispered, "we burn this place to the ground." But the cultists didn't wait. They melted out of the darkness like living shadows, their razors and scalpels catching the light as they closed in around us. "Pain is truth." They chanted, the sound reverberating through the air, a war drum heralding our doom. "Not today." I roared, hurling the first Molotov toward them. The glass shattered, and fire erupted, a wall of flame that licked the edges of their robes, forcing them to scatter. Kyle swung his crowbar, the metal crunching against bone as he cleaved into the first cultist. Rip lunged forward, her knife flashing as she slashed through fabric and flesh, leaving trails of crimson in her wake. I grabbed the chainsaw, yanking the starter cord with a primal scream. It roared to life, sputtering violently, and I charged. The blade chewed through a cultist's arm, severing it with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed, hot and thick, coating my face and filling the air with the coppery stench of violence. The cultist collapsed, gurgling, but the others swarmed in, razors flashing. They grabbed at me, pulling at my limbs, their chants growing louder. I felt a blade slice into my side, white-hot agony searing through me. But I lashed out, swinging the chainsaw blindly. It bit into flesh, and the screams mingled with the whine of the engine. Keep pushing. Rip screamed, her voice nearly lost in the chaos. She tossed another Molotov, the explosion of fire casting the room in an eerie, hellish glow. The cultists shrieked, their robes catching alight as they flailed, but Morse, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a zealot. You cannot escape your destiny, he hissed, stepping toward me, a scalpel glinting in his hand. You belong to the god. I stumbled back, my vision blurring from blood loss and exhaustion. He moved closer, his movements almost leisurely, savoring the moment. Behind him, the cultists chanted louder, their voices rising to a fever pitch. Pain is truth. Pain is truth. No, I snarled, raising the chainsaw. You belong to me. I swung the chainsaw in a wide arc, aiming for the leader's midsection. But he was faster than I expected. He sidestepped, the blade grazing his robes as he darted forward, plunging the scalpel into my shoulder. Pain ripped through me, and I screamed, dropping to one knee. Kyle rushed in, swinging the crowbar toward the leader's head. But the leader twisted, grabbing Kyle by the throat and slamming him into the ground. The sound of bone hitting concrete echoed through the chamber. No! I roared, lunging forward. The leader turned toward me, his eyes wide in surprise, as I swung the chainsaw up with every ounce of strength I had left. The blade connected, tearing into his side. Blood sprayed in a torrent, and he let out a guttural scream, stumbling back. I didn't stop. I pressed forward, hacking and slashing until the leader crumpled to the ground. His mask clattering away, revealing a face twisted in agony. I stood there, gasping, the chainsaw sputtering to a halt. The leader lay at my feet, his eyes staring up at me, still filled with that awful, unyielding belief. But now, they were dimming, flickering like a candle in a storm. The cultists froze, their chanting faltering. For a heartbeat, there was silence, a fragile, haunting quiet that filled the room. Rip stepped forward, blood splattered across her face, her knife glistening in the firelight. Finish it, she growled, staggered to the center of the chamber. With trembling hands, I lit the remaining Molotovs, the flames casting grotesque shadows across the walls. I hurled them at the altars, the makeshift racks, the symbols carved into the stone. Fire erupted, consuming everything in its path. The cultists screamed, retreating into the darkness as the flames roared to life. Smoke filled the air, choking and acrid, as the temple began to crumble around us. Go! Rip shouted, grabbing my arm and dragging me toward the exit. Kyle stumbled after us, clutching his side, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. We crashed through the doorway and into the blinding light of the early morning. The temple's death cries echoing behind us, we collapsed on the ground, gasping, the heat of the fire at our backs. I looked up at the sky, the dawn creeping over the horizon. We had done it. We had burned their sanctuary to the ground, but as I lay there, staring up at the lightning sky, a chill crept over me. The leader's last words echoed in my mind, "You cannot escape your destiny. You belong to the god." I turned my head to look at Rip. Her eyes were fixed on the smoke billowing from the temple ruins, her expression hard and unreadable. "It's over," I whispered, but my voice wavered. "Isn't it?" Rip didn't answer. She glanced at me, her eyes cold and empty. And then, she slowly pulled up her sleeve, revealing a fresh, jagged scar etched into her forearm, a symbol I recognized all too well. "The symbol of the cult of razors, over," she murmured, a smile ghosting across her lips. "No. Not yet." A sickening realization washed over me as I stumbled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. Had we truly escaped, or had we simply unleashed a new nightmare? I backed away, my legs quivering, as Rip turned and walked toward the smoldering ruins, his eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice a strangled whisper. I stared at the ruins, at Rip's retreating figure, my mind a storm of confusion and horror. "We keep running," I whispered. "We keep fighting. Because this isn't over." The wind carried the faintest sound, the whisper of razors, the echo of a chant. "Pain is truth. Pain is truth." And in that moment, I knew, the cult was not dead. The temple might burn, but their belief, their hunger for suffering, would rise from the ashes. We had escaped for now, but the darkness was still out there, waiting. I gripped the hatchet tighter, my knuckles white, as I turned away from the ruins. The nightmare had only changed its form, and the hunt. The hunt was just beginning.